Greetings from the far side of the galaxy. I'm Fury, your host, the most, here to tell you another story about titties. Anyways, there's an event all about Christmas and stuff and whatnot, so I suppose it's about time I get to making one of these. So, here's what's new in the Great Edo Christmas event. Up first will be the ever-popular Gang Li with his 4th limited unit. To start, Gang Li is a transient from Penglai, the world based on Chinese mythology. In Tokyo, he attends Umamichi Academy, the school for delinquents, although he's much more of a slacker. As for his guild, he's a member of the Asakusa Gurus, and we do get some information about them in his new unit's research file. Gang Li was inspired by a story you've probably heard of, The Journey to the West. Starting out, he was in the Heavenly Navy, commanding a multitude of ships. However, after drunkenly harassing the moon goddess Chang'e, he gets banished to Earth. In some versions of the tale, he's sentenced to living 100 lives, all of which will end in a love tragedy. One such life has him dying by falling into a pig well, which causes him to reincarnate as a pig monster, which earns him the name Zhu Gang Li. Sun Zhang and Sun Wukong find him terrorizing a village, possibly kidnapping the chief's daughter to force him to marry her. However, after beating him, they learn that Guan Yin has tasked him with aiding their journey to the west. And thus, Zhu Gang Li gets his name changed to Zhu Baiji as a reminder of the 8 Buddhist precepts he's supposed to maintain. At the end of the journey, rather than reaching enlightenment, Zhu Baiji gets rewarded with becoming the one who eats leftover offerings. Notably, he's also the patron deity of masseuses, hostesses, and sex workers in Taiwan and parts of East Asia. Way to go, you funky little pig man. The Gang Li we see in-game appears to be taken from a point in time before a journey to the west actually begins, explaining why he goes by Gang Li. He did use a rake as a weapon in the story, and through his research file we know that he used to serve in the Navy just like he did in the book. Although, there's actually something rather interesting in his new research file. Sometimes he flashes to the day he lost his wife, which is why he acts aloof and indulges himself as a flirty playboy.
I miss my wife, Tails. I miss her a lot.
I don't know if this means Gang Li is either divorced or a widower, but I'm amazed this pig slinked puss at one point. The other interesting tidbit in Gang Li's research file that I mentioned earlier is this name right here, Sanzou. The name Sanzou is another way of saying San Zhang, the main monk and protagonist of the story Journey to the West. As for his new unit, it's 5 stars, nether attribute entitled All the Worldly Desires for Christmas. I do want to point out that the title is actually rather clever for its double meaning. On one hand, worldly can mean someone who's very materialistic and not concerned with spiritual goals. And on the other hand, worldly can also mean someone who's very experienced and wise about the ways of the world. So worldly is actually a pretty good way to sum up Gang Li's character. His first skill is named Lazy Bastard. That's rude. He gains immobility at phase start and gives immobility strengthening to himself and allies, doubling their damage. After moving, he has a 90% chance to apply immobility to allies on his left and right, and moves up to 16 CP to hit units at 90% after hitting. And on odd turns, at turn start, he gets glint to himself at 80%. The second skill is Players of the Great Edo Holy Night, getting guts when appearing and regen to himself and allies after moving in 1 square. And before hitting, he applies Rage and Buff Reversal to hit units. The third skill is Those Who Travel Together. After hitting, he applies Unction to himself and allies in 1 square at 70%. At turn start, he applies Spirit to himself and allies at 80%, and he also gives Spirit Strengthening to himself and allies when appearing, nearly doubling their damage. The final skill is Future Boar of the 8 Precepts, a reference to the fact that he will get the name Zhu Baiji in the future. At phase start, he grants increased recovery to allies in 1 square at 90%. And after hitting, he gets up to 300 HP to himself, although thanks to the increased recovery, it's more like 450 HP. And also, after hitting, he gives null debuff to himself and adjacent allies at 60%. His charge skill is Shoot Range and gives Archer to adjacent allies while applying immobility, crit, and guts to himself. As a unit, Gang Li is, fine. His damage is fine thanks to the immobility and spirit strengthening, and that glint does help him when his proc isn't 100%. He does have decent support skills as well, like buff reversal, regen, and null debuff, which I do appreciate. For team building, his ability to clear rows thanks to his damage and shoot range means he pairs well with Nightglow's Kurogane, but Kurogane isn't at a shortage for partners. You could get some mileage pairing him with Loki since he'll benefit from the immobility strengthening and those support skills will keep him from dying. As a unit, he's a bit like Upstart Goblin from Yu-Gi-Oh! A decent generic option to fit in if you have free space, but you can definitely find better specific options. And now for the second guy to get a new unit, Anan Bator. To start, Anan Bator is from a story you may recall if you watched the video I did on Snow, clicky clicky linky linky, the epic of King Gasar. However, it's important to note that Snow and Anan come from different versions of the same story. Snow comes from the Tibetan version and Anan comes from the Buryat version. Please make note that it was almost impossible to find any pronunciation guides for this, so I'm like 90% sure I'm pronouncing this stuff all wrong. In the version Anan comes from, he's born as Buk Baligte, the middle child of Han Hormasta Tengur. His father's main enemy is Atai Ulan, a name that gets dropped in his normal 5 stars research file, and the only reason I was able to find any information. Buk Baligte first makes a name for himself when Atai Ulan casts a spell that makes one of the gods fall sick. He takes it upon himself to find the bird, a giant lark, which can cure the sick goddess. Then, sometime later, Atai Ulan and Han Hormasta get into a fight. Han Hormasta wins at first, but Atai Ulan comes back stronger than before. Buk Baligte gets word of Atai Ulan's weakness and ends up throwing a spear through Atai Ulan's big toe on his right foot, and yes, it is specified. Han Hormasta then chops up Atai Ulan's body and throws it down to the earth, but the remains fester and end up becoming demons. When prompted to solve the problem, Buk Baligte once more stands up, deciding to come down to earth as a mortal man to slay said demons. And that's where the prologue of the Buryat version of the Epic of King Gasar ends. That's right, the prologue. This is all the first branch of the epic, with the rest taking place in the mortal world as Buk Baligte, now born an immortal man, undoes the damage and slays demons. The epic is actually a fascinating thing. I'll include a link to the translation of it in the description, but that aside, let's get into Husamo's interpretations. One interesting thing is that Buk Baligte is referred to as the Red Middle Sun, explaining why he goes by the name Anan Bator, which means Red Hero. The epic also briefly has Buk transform into a bird, saying he soared like a hawk and flew like an eagle, explaining why Anan has wings in game. Life on Earth appears to have taken him from after his story is already over and he saved the world time and time again, explaining why in Tokyo he's doing his best to avoid that for the nth time. My favorite interpretation is that his artifact is a repelling rope, indicative of Buk Baligte's decision to come down to Earth. It even makes sense that he's the world pillar, seeing as how King Gasar is a figure that's prayed to. He's a way to connect the people of the now with the ancestors of their past, which is what a world pillar which can retain memories even through loops can do. And now we move on to Ulan's new unit from the event. It's 5 stars, either attribute and bow type, and it's titled the Hero of the Red Holy Night. The first skill is either Idle Wanderer or Free Spirited Descendant. When hit, he applies Drain to hitting units, and after hitting, applies Anchor to himself and allies in 1 square at 80%. At turn start, he gives up to 300 HP to himself and allies in 1 square at 90%, and at phase start applies non-buff weakening to himself and enemies, making it so that when they don't have a removable buff, they take double damage. The second skill is Gisir Bogdo of Disaster. Gisir Bogdo being a character from another Mongolian folktale that I really can't get into at the moment. Maybe in another fun facts video. Wink wink. Subtle foreshadowing is very subtle. He is immune to possession, and at phase start he gives himself spirit. After being debuffed, he applies nourishment to allies in 1 square and purification to himself and adjacent allies at 90%. He also gets an advantage against a whole lot of debuffs, like my god. Notably, I will say that Gisir Bogdo's story does involve the creation of maggots, which eat carcasses and purify the earth, explaining why this skill gives nourishment, purification, and hates debuffs. His third skill is Great Edo Holy Knight's Firefighter, fittingly giving him burn resistance to himself and allies when appearing. After moving, he applies break to enemies in bow range at 90% and null buff to hit units and remove buff to enemies near it units at 90 and 70% respectively. The final skill is Those Who Are at Peace with the Future. At phase start, he gets concentration to himself at 100, and then after being buffed, he gets arousal to himself at 90, up to 8 CP to himself at 40, and applies protection to allies in a 2 square diamond radius at 50. His charge skill has bow range. Before hitting, he removes all buffs to hit units, applies null buff to enemies near hit units, applies CS lock to hit units, and brawn to himself. Like Gang Lee, he's another unit that's on the better half of mid. He's got some cool things going for him, like his non-buff strengthening, but it's really held back by Husamo's buff strategy, best being described as apply directly to the forehead. His ability to consistently inflict null buff and remove buff is another cool feature, but not enough to make him shine. I feel like a skill evo that improves his proc and really leans into his buff hatred could make this unit work a lot better. And coming in after the firefighter will be the crime fighter. Of course, I'm talking about Horus. Horus' story in the mythology begins with his father being murdered by Set. However, Osiris' wife, oh god, this is Persona 3 all over again. Osiris' wife, who shall not be named, manages to piece her husband's body together and resurrect him so they can do the nasty and conceive an heir, that being Horus. Thus begins a long and varied series of accounts on Set and Horus contending for the throne. One story has Horus tearing Set's nuts off and Set tearing out his eye, and another has stuff you can't do to lettuce without losing your job at Burger King. The point is that at the end of it all, Horus does win. The way Husamo interpreted all of this is actually fairly important to the overarching lore since Horus is a world representative. The competition between Seth and Horus, and when I say Seth, I don't mean the one in Tokyo, Ash, but the exile of Aru, Seth. The contendings between Seth and Horus did happen in the lore, but it's worth noting that it was much friendlier and mostly just for show, but all of that ended when Horus' father was murdered. The weapon was found in Seth's room, and when called to the stand, Seth didn't even defend himself. Despite the conviction, Horus let his uncle leave Aru in exile, and it was only after this that Horus learned Seth had been framed. So overall, Horus' story in Husamo is very different from the myth. Also, it's canon that Horus' favorite food is lettuce. I expect some weird fanfiction about that. The research file for Horus' new unit appears to be focused on the fact that Horus wants to give something in return. He doesn't want so much as to give something specific, but to be the one that gives to show that he is an adult. It ties into the themes of Horus' character about not feeling like he deserves the throne and not having shown the uncle he respected his capability. Now that I think about it, that may be due to in the myth, the reason Set even had a claim to the throne was because Horus was too young to take power. Anyways, his new unit is 4 stars, either attribute, sword type, and it's titled The Great Judgment of the Holy Knight. His first skill is called Great Edo Holy Knight Fire Thief Revised. I'm not making that up, that's what Google Translate is telling me. Before hitting, he applies Bind to hit units and enemies near them at 80%, at phase start he applies Fear in a square ahead of him at 90%. And whether or not he moves, he applies Fear Advantage to himself and allies in 1 square around himself at 80%. The second skill is Frontline Elite. At phase start, he gives up to 1000 HP to allies at 90%. When hit, he applies Defense Up to himself and allies on his left and right at 80%, and after being buffed, he applies Protection to himself and adjacent allies at 50%. And finally, he's immune to darkness. The third skill is One Who Will Match in the Future, another name I can't quite figure out. At the end of the move phase, he gives a skill that removes Bind to allies in 1 square at 90%. After moving, he applies Reflect Debuff to himself and allies at 80% and Vigor to himself and allies in the same range at 90%. His final skill is the Correct Falcon. Before being attacked, he gives up to 400 HP to adjacent allies at 60%. At phase start, he applies Concentration to himself and adjacent allies at 90% and Tenacity to himself. He also gets increased horizontal movement bonus and remove debuff after being buffed at 60%. His charge skill has long slash range. Before hitting, he applies concentration to himself and adjacent allies along with giving up to 20 CP to allies in one square around himself. Horus is actually pretty vibey as a support unit. He's quite generous with his selection of defense up, reflect debuff, vigor, and concentration, giving him a good range of attack and defense improvements. And that fear skill is amazing. The fact that he also gives fear advantage to his allies is just a nice bonus. Fittingly, he pairs well with Christmas Turing, whose ability to spread buffs can alleviate some of that pressure on his buffs being only adjacent allies. The next stop on our list will be Turing, the guildmaster of the Akihabara creators. He's based on Alan Turing, who's not a myth but a real person. He's considered a national hero for his role in World War II as a codebreaker, cracking the Nazi Enigma machine. However, after the war, Turing was convicted of gross indecency, a legal euphemism for homosexuality, which was illegal in Britain. After 12 months of forced hormone treatment, Turing continued his work in Manchester in 1953. But 1 year later, in 1954, Turing was found dead by way of cyanide. Whether it was suicide, an accident, or even assassination is unknown. Though, posthumously, Britain has acknowledged that their treatment of Turing was appalling and given him a royal pardon. A lot of details from the real Turing's life match up with the character in Housamo. For one, we know that Turing is half British in-game. He also enjoys solving riddles, explaining why he's friends with Sphinx, which is a reference to his real work on breaking the Enigma code. Turing's research file for his new unit is honestly pretty boneless. It doesn't contain any new lore or character details, but if you want to live out your dream of a femboy Christmas date, go ahead and give it a read. His new unit is 4 stars, wood attribute, and shoop type.
Excuse me, the fuck did you just say?
And shoop type, and it's titled The Snow White Christmas. A subtle reference to the fact that he was very taken with Disney's Snow White movie, which was recently released at the time, and that he died by biting into a cyanide-laced poison apple. The first skill is one who wears thin clothes. I feel like a few of you are gonna enjoy that detail a bit too much. When appearing, he gives tenacity strengthening to himself and allies, boosting their activation rate by 10% when they have tenacity. He also gets an attack advantage against tenacity and applies tenacity to himself at phase start. His second skill is Great Holy Knight Passerby. When appearing, he makes allies spread 3 buffs after moving to adjacent allies. After being buffed, he applies limit to himself and 80 and ardor to allies in slash range at 70%. For skill 3, after moving on phase turn 1, applies possession to enemies in 3 squares and an advantage against charm and charm to all enemies in that range at 100%. He's also immune to confusion and possession and removes up to 1500 HP to enemies near hit units. The final skill is One Who Sees the Future. After hitting, he applies glint to himself and allies in 3 squares ahead at 60% and at phase start applies reflect debuff to himself at 90%. And on the start of turns 1, 2, and 3, he applies crit to allies ahead of him at 90%. Turing's charge skill has shoot range. Before hitting, he applies weakness to hit units and gives up to 1000 HP to himself and allies in 1 square. Much like Horus, Turing is a surprisingly good unit. I really like his spread buff skill since it's a good way to improve your moving unit's buff spread. And tenacity strengthening is actually kind of goated because tenacity is one of the most common buffs in the game. And the final character will be the newest as we close out by covering Otter. Despite what you may think, Otter isn't actually from the world of Aru. Rather, he's from the world of Kamui Koten, which is based on Ainu mythology. According to what little information I could find, and I seriously mean little information, the only source I could find was a PBS site from the year 2000. Otter comes from an Ainu legend about mankind's creation. You see, as a god was making humans, they suddenly had urgent business to take care of. So, they left instructions for the god that would finish their work with a nearby otter, but the otter shirked their duties. The otter ended up completely forgetting the instructions, and as such, all otters forevermore were cursed with a bad memory. Notably, due to Otter pretending to be from Aru, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention their role in Egyptian mythology. It's a very light one, and oftentimes they're conflated with mongooses, but supposedly they prayed to the goddess Wedjet. Likely due to the otters in Otter's, oh god, this is going to get so confusing so quickly, inspiration just being regular animals. It makes sense that Otter doesn't have a specific name. They weren't magical creatures, they were quite literally just otters. And that thing about Otter being hated in his home world probably links back to the myth of the otter that failed to do its job. And since he is new, I figured I might as well go over Otter as a character in Housamo. Like I said before, Otter is from the world of Kamui Koten, not Aru. Though the specific reason isn't given, it does mention that otters were hated in his home world. And so, to get the attention he never got back home, he works at the Asakusa Fluffy Zone, which is kind of like a petting zoo but for anthros. Honestly, I just don't vibe with that. The idea of a sheep being able to talk back as I pet it is just... ugh. Although, the Fluffy Zone job is just a side gig because we know he's a police officer working alongside Horus and Nobumichi. He's also a member of the Entertainers, yes, those assholes from Yorakucho, but he's also a member of the Rule Makers. Despite being from Kamui Koten and not Aru, his sacred artifact is a kopesh, a kind of curved sword. On its most basic level, anything cut by it is divided. That's how Otter uses it to make people smaller. However, a certain femboy mathematician is aware of its true power to freeze the world by dividing things into a single finite point. I don't really have much more to say about him, so let's get to taking a look at his new, well, only 4-star unit. It's 4 stars, Aether attribute and long/type, and it's titled the Chibi Justice. The first skill is Otter looking up at heaven. After moving, he pulls in enemies by 1 square and gets tenacity to himself. That's alongside increased vertical movement and madness immunity. The second skill is Miniaturization Expeller. After moving, he gets combo to himself at 90, evasion to allies and acceleration to himself and allies on his left and right at 60 and 80% respectively. Third skill, Waiting Room Geisha. When hit, he applies charm to hitting units at 40% and before being attacked gets up to 300 HP to himself at 60%. The final skill is called Naughty Person in a cold region. Before hitting, he applies freeze to hit units at 50% and deals nearly double damage to freeze affected enemies. He also applies remove buff to hit units before hitting at 40% and healing reversal to enemies in front of him at 90%. His charge skill has long/range. Before hitting, he applies freeze to hit units and nearby enemies and does nearly double damage against charm. Well, at least this isn't a 4-star that's better than the 5 stars. Wait, that's not a good thing. At least he has a lot of on-movement skills demanding your most important resource for lackluster effects. Wait, that's not good either. At least his unit looks good? Yeah, I can work with that. To rank the units, Turing comes in first with Horus in second, although you could probably convince me to switch around those units if you tried. Then it'll probably be Gang Lee and Anan Bator in third and fourth, and Otter is there. But that aside, it's about time I end this video and get to the Patreon shoutouts. For our 3 stars, we have special thanks to 87 Werehog, Deku, Zora Chow, Choron, Garen Lefay, Dragon King Yara, Anon RC, Lightning Shadow, and Kayun. For 4 stars, we have Miki Moon and Miko, the Pure Beast. And for our Super D-Tuper special 5-star shoutouts, we have... First, Vanilla Flower, the Sun Transgressor. Second, Poor Mage, the Afterschool Chocolate Magic. Then, the Good Old Days, the Enshrined Deity. Followed by Hodari Lion, the Flash of Speed. Next, Sky King 64, the Morning Marcher. And finally, Mahagasaur, the Sunset Rider. Thank you for watching, do be sure to like and subscribe, and as always, this is Rose Fury signing out.